Hello. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started now. We tried to wait just a couple more minutes to let some of our folks get in on Zoom. And I think we'll probably have some more who will join us as we go through this. Just a real quick background on how these got started. We sort of laugh about it now because it seems a little surreal and like it happened a decade ago. It was actually just a few months ago. But the day that we had our very first COVID positive case in Williamson County, we immediately, that same day, got a call together, an emergency call with all of our HR executives saying, what are you doing? How can we help? Let's collaborate and work through this together. And that started this process for us. So now we are having these. We started with a conference call that was one where you couldn't see who called in and you couldn't track anything, and you certainly couldn't see faces. To we've obviously grown, and now we've got Zoom, and everything feels great. And it was really awesome just now, a few minutes ago, to get on and see Kelly Hodges' face. Like some folks that you just don't get to see as much as you used to, and it's like, oh, it feels like old times now. Let's chat. We actually got caught up and chatted a little too long. But as I was saying, this started and it's evolved, and the purpose of these is really to help the Williamson County, and now it's actually become to some degree Middle Tennessee, the business community collaborate and really get a gauge on what each other are doing. It's easy to read headlines and say, okay, this is what a company's doing in San Francisco, or this is what a company's doing in New York. That doesn't always work for our own local communities. And so the purpose of this is to really figure out what each other's doing, to help sort of gauge, when are we going to do reentry? What's that going to look like? We're still taking very casual surveys of our employers to say, what does your reentry process look like? Williamson County specifically, we've only got one major employer who is at full capacity. Most of our employers are either still waiting to do any sort of reentry, or are doing very small percentages of reentry with their employees. The majority of them only have a small crew of people who kind of have to be in the office. But those have been easy decisions to make when you hear that other employers in Williamson County are doing the same things. And this has been, I think, an incredible resource for our HR executives. And so we wanted to continue this conversation. It's evolved where we've had multiple experts come on and just speak. And then what we find is that we get a ton of Q&A at the end and not enough time to get all those questions. And so we thought today's format would be best if we literally just did an entire session with questions and answers. So with that being said, I've got questions for our panelists that I'm going to ask. I don't have to ask them. Most of these questions are things that our HR executives have sent in to us. So there are things that are already being talked about. I don't have to ask them all. So if you'll look down at the bottom of your screen now, there's a little tab that says Q&A. Now there's also a chat section. We can chat, but the Q&A will help us track your questions. So if you will, as we're going through this process, if something pops up for you, chime in there with your questions, and we will get to as many of those as possible. We do have Nick Beneker on with us. He's not showing his face right now, but he's here to facilitate. So if anything pops up, he'll be able to help us as well. Most of you know Nick at this point because he's been running most of these programs for us. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. We have John Wingo and Rebecca Weiss with Stites and Harbison. John is going to talk about some of the work that he's been doing at the state level around liability protection legislation. And then Rebecca is really their expert on employment law. And so she's going to be an incredible resource to answer some of their big questions. Dennis Georgatos is going to be speaking from an employer perspective. So what does it look like for the local Skanska office to bring back in employees? And then Kelly Hodges with Gresham is going to talk about some of the work they've been doing around designing spaces, reconfiguring offices, and then just really what are employers and companies looking for as they move to transition folks back in. So again, I mentioned I've got some questions prepared. We'll go ahead and get started here. I think our panelists, most of you are muted, some of you aren't, so just make sure when we get to you that you unmute yourself. Dennis, I'll start with you. It's been a few months now of people working from home. One thing that has come up, and this felt like we just discussed this yesterday with some HR executives, it feels incredibly tricky and complicated, but how do you evaluate performance of remote employees, and how do you give corrective action, or if you have to, how do you terminate? Because these are just It's not obviously not, no one wants to fire someone on Zoom, but quite frankly, no one wants to give corrective action on Zoom either. So what does that look like for you? And can you give some guidance of how maybe you and Skanska have helped navigate these waters?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, one good thing for us is we've been open to allowing folks to work from home and have a flexible schedule now for a couple of years. So thankfully, when this started, and obviously we said, hey, everyone start working from home. It's for a lot of folks, it wasn't the first time they were doing this. So a lot of folks were already comfortable with that process, working from home, and managers, I would say, were also somewhat comfortable managing as well. Now, granted, in most cases, folks were doing it 2 or 3 days a week, and now it was more on a full-time basis. I feel like we had the tools in place, whether it be WebEx or Skype, to communicate with our folks. And to me, that's probably the main key is communication. I think, over the last couple of months, more than ever before, I think, communicating with the employees, checking in with them daily, it was huge. For myself, as I oversee the office here locally, I'd have a all hands meeting every Friday afternoon, just to check in with our folks, kind of give them an update on, what I felt like was going on with the state orders or the local orders, and just take the temperature of the group and make sure I was staying connected to them, answering any questions, any concerns. In many ways, our construction was deemed as a necessary or essential business. So all our job sites were open the entire time. We never shut down any job sites. So we always had folks going to our job sites that needed our support, and needed our support obviously from a job perspective, but also from a personal perspective as well, because in my mind they were putting themselves in danger day in and day out, going into work in downtown Nashville, just because of what was going on. So to me, the main thing was communication, I think, with our folks and with your employees, and making sure you're staying connected to them so that they don't feel lost, they don't feel disconnected from the group. I think that was the main thing for me.
So I see you're sitting, I think, in your office. I assume that's not your home.
I am.
And so I'm
curious.
No. What is Skanska doing currently from a re-entry perspective? What does that look like for your office there?
Actually, this week was our first week of re-entry. See, I got this neck gaiter on, so at my desk, thankfully our workstations are all 8-foot workstations, so we all sit 6 foot apart technically. But we once you move around though, I put my neck gaiter, I put it on, and when I get back to my desk, I could take it back off. So this week was our first week of reentry. We invited, back 2 of the departments. So about 50% of our office is back today, or back this week. And we have, the company set guidelines, I guess, for our reopening, and what could be used, what can't be used in terms of, kitchen equipment, coffee makers, ice makers, all that stuff. A lot of it we've had to shut down. We'd like to have, if you've been to our office many times, we'd like to have communal food here. All that's shut down. We put away all our, silverware and China type stuff, plates and all that, and have had to move to just paper stuff and plasticware right now. So it's definitely is an adjustment. We've had to, like all our conference rooms, everyone's spaced at least 6 foot apart. So a room that maybe once sat 8 people now only sits like 3 people. We have a lot of little huddle rooms that would sit 3 or 4 people previously. Well, now it can only sit 1 person, just based on trying to make sure we're socially distancing. So the company's done a good job of setting guidelines for us. Being a nationwide company, we have offices in places like New York, Washington, D.C., Washington State, L.A., San Francisco, that were hotbeds for COVID-19. So the company, while they realize not every office is the same, but we still have to protect all our employees regardless. So I think the company's done a good job of giving us some really good guidelines to follow here locally to allow us to begin to open our office. And like I said, just started actually this week. Okay.
I have to ask, do you have coffee out?
We do. We have coffee, refrigerators can be used, and microwaves. So what and some of it you look at, we had to shut down like toaster ovens and all that. And I was thinking, I'm like, what? why is one okay, not the other?
Right.
What they're trying to do is minimize touch points, I guess.
Right.
I've gone out to eat like 3 times so far, and I figure if I go out to eat 3 times versus maybe 20 times, you're minimizing your chances of something happening. So a lot of it's about touch points. We have obviously a lot of hand sanitizer and hand wipes around the entire office, in every room, near every piece of equipment. We're trying to do the best we can and everything we can to provide a safe environment and make, folks feel comfortable. The other thing we do is we have a phone app that asks a series of 6 questions about COVID-19, whether or not, we have a 0 tolerance policy. If you're sick, stay home. If you have anything whatsoever, just stay home. So everyone before they come to the office has to go through that online app and just answer the questions about any type of symptoms they may be having. Anyone that might, obviously be sick at home, make sure they've done a temperature check on themselves before they come into the office. Just trying to keep everyone safe and respect everyone.
Yeah. It was interesting. I was having a conversation with an HR executive yesterday who was laughing about, but in a I don't know, serious sort of way too, of the coffee and just the supply closet.
Yeah.
And then it came down to the sugar packets of, we've only got 10
people
in the office right now, but they want their sugar for their coffee. And how do you do
we're allowed
that?
to have sugar. We're allowed to have sugar and creamer packets, but not like, the jars of sugar or jars of cream or anything like that. So,
Right.
we can have individual packets that someone can take and use, but that's it.
Right. It feels like a good time. John, I'd like to transition to you for just a second and talk about some of the legislative work that you've been doing. You're on the board of the Tennessee Business Roundtable, and I know that you've been helping at the state level really around employer protection. So
correct.
Can you talk a little bit about that as we're talking about whether or not you can have sugar packets and
yeah.
coffee
Well,
pods?
and we're doing all those same things internally as well. And lawsuits are not the first thing on everyone's mind, but I think they're somewhere on everyone's mind, and what liability, depending on the type of business you have, you're worried about it more or less, especially people that have a lot of customer interaction. And so there is the Tennessee Business Roundtable, along with a whole slew of other business organizations and trade groups, have put together some legislation that is working its way through this extended legislative session that's going on in Nashville right now. And who knows what it's going to look like at the end of the day. It's going to go through the legislative process. Kel may be involved, and certainly he's been involved in things like this. And what starts out looking one thing comes out looking another. But there is a piece of legislation going through that has the general backing of I think both chambers of the legislature and the governor to protect companies from liability when those companies are at least trying to do the types of things that Dennis just talked about at his company. And this doesn't deal with employee liability as much. That's going to be a workers' comp issue, but this is going to be liability to employees' families, potentially, if employees get sick at home and then go home, customers, et cetera. And the way it's drafted and what's working its way through right now would, without getting into too much legalese, but it would increase the pleading standard. So the lawsuit that would be filed against somebody would have to plead with particularity what that company did wrong. It would provide a safe harbor for those companies if they were complying with the government requirements, whether it be OSHA, whether it be the Tennessee Pledge, whether it be the CDC guidelines, whatever's applicable to them. And it would reduce the damages that a plaintiff could receive if they did get sick, so long as they didn't have serious injury. Now, whether all of those things come out of it or not, I don't know, but I think there will be some sort of legislation in Tennessee that does reduce liability for companies that, first of all, have a plan to comply with the government guidelines and then carry it out. So I think from an HR point of view, for folks that straddle that line between employer communication or management and then the employees, it's going to be important to make sure that there's a plan in place and that the employees are following it. And I look at it as a compliance type issue. If obviously the most important thing is to protect the employees, and if that's being done, then you're probably already in compliance. But if folks are doing that, then it gives them that added safe harbor protection against third-party claims. It's the group of trade groups that are behind that is pretty broad. I mean, it's everything from healthcare, retailers, restaurants, et cetera. Everybody is behind some sort of safe harbor protection. It's designed to go out of existence in a couple of years. So this isn't some long-term thing. It's been crafted to deal with the concerns that we have right now. And it's being designed to protect folks that are doing the right thing, like Dennis just talked about at Skanska. So I could go into lots of detail about it, but I won't. But that's in the works. And I think we'll probably know something within 2 or 3 weeks with the way the legislature is moving, and we'll be able to come back and everybody will be able to look at what's passed and then know what they need to do to keep the company from being open to. I think the purpose is to avoid frivolous lawsuits or a flood of lawsuits.
Right.
Which is bad for me, but good for business.
Right. So Rebecca, on the other side of that, looking at the legal concerns and liabilities around taking employee temperatures and asking health-related questions, can you talk about maybe some blind spots that our employers may be experiencing, or some things that they're just not seeing?
Well, I think, so first of all, with respect to temperature taking and asking about symptoms, that is an inquiry that's governed by the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Tennessee counterpart to that. So it applies to most employers. If you've got 8 or more employees, you're going to fall under these provisions. And ordinarily, when you make a medical inquiry with respect to an employee, it's got to be job related and consistent with business necessity. And so there are different rules when there is a direct threat present. And what that means is that there's a threat to either that employee or someone else in the workplace because of that employee's disability or medical condition. Given the pandemic status declared by the CDC and WHO, the EEOC says currently, because we are under pandemic status, we are allowed as employer to ask about temperature and all of the symptoms that the CDC identifies as being indicative of a COVID case. And so right now those inquiries are permitted. We have to be careful for a number of reasons. First of all, it's okay with respect to current employees. It's still not okay with respect to applicants. So, I don't know many people who are hiring right now, but a lot of folks were, strapped for workforce and warm bodies in the door beforehand. And for essential businesses in particular, that may still be true. And so to the extent that you are hiring people, you are not allowed to make these inquiries with respect to temperature and any sort of medical symptoms. And they've got to be something that's at the post-offer stage. So that doesn't mean that you can't ask any questions which might elicit discussion related to the pandemic or coronavirus. So for example, you can ask about whether they're in their prior employment, they were terminated or laid off, and the cause for termination or layoff. And that's not necessarily a question that's driven toward their medical symptoms, but then that might result in a disclosure. And I think that kind of thing is okay, but you've got to really hit the pause button with applicants. Otherwise, again, with respect to current employees, it's okay. And really, in fact, you should be asking those questions because of CDC guidance and the Tennessee Pledge and ensuring and OSHA and ensuring that your workplaces are safe, because I think the concern from a legal perspective is that those guidance, whether they are binding or not, are certainly going to be used by plaintiffs' attorneys down the road to argue that there's a duty of care. And I think I'm getting a lot of questions from employers saying, well, isn't this just all going to be covered by workers' comp? And the answer to that is not necessarily. There are a number of other statutes that might protect an employee who complains about an employer's failure to follow those procedures from a safety perspective, and then they sort of shroud themselves with whistleblower type protections for which you can't retaliate against them. Even employers who are not unionized are still covered by things like the National Labor Relations Act, which permits employees to engage in concerted activity and discuss workplace conditions freely and without retaliation. And so there are a number of little nuanced crevices in employment law where plaintiffs' attorneys are certainly going to find their way to if they haven't already. And so, even if we are saying, well, if they contract the virus at work, it might be covered by workers' comp. There are a number of statutes that might apply anyway. Additionally, in Tennessee, you've got an affirmative duty potentially to anything that's foreseeable, to the extent that you're exposing your employees to the virus in the workplace. So it's a 2008 case that's really dealing with asbestos exposure, but I think this is sort of a blind spot that a lot of people aren't thinking about. And in that case, there was a daughter of an employee who contracted cancer because of exposure to asbestos from the dad coming home with, asbestos on the clothing and, donning and doffing that off every day. And the Tennessee Supreme Court said, well, employer, that would be foreseeable if your employee had exposure to asbestos in the workplace, that they would be tracking that home and exposing the people they live with, whether that's family, a roommate, or whatever. So there may be some potential third-party liability there, which would not be covered by traditional work comp statutes. And so then you're dealing with negligence claims and that kind of thing. So I think that's something that maybe is in the periphery right now, because I think everyone is still just trying to figure out, what are we supposed to do with our workspace, and do we need masks, and can we get hand sanitizer? But I think as part of what you're doing as employer, and if you've got a committee or a task force, you ought to think through, okay, what is the plaintiff's attorney going to think about this, and then work backwards from there in terms of your planning. And I think that tends to be really helpful for folks.
Right. Wow. So a little bit on that point then, as we think about employees who aren't ready to come back to the office, but the office has said we're ready to open, what sort of protections does that employee have in terms of being able to say from maybe it's just a mental health perspective, or I just don't feel safe? Like, what does that look like, and are they able to do that?
Yeah, so, I think it gets tough. And, of course, with the events of the past couple of weeks, add in the additional layer of, if I'm working in a downtown office and there's protests going on, I'm afraid to come into the workplace. I'm getting questions like that too. If there's a generalized fear for safety in the workplace, there's not necessarily a protection for that under, let's say, OSHA. However, you need to put a pin in that thinking, because it's really a balancing act. So the first step you need to think about is, okay, am I dealing with someone who's high risk? Am I dealing with someone who has a high risk individual at home? Am I dealing with someone who has a disability? Am I dealing with someone in the protest context who has to walk 5 blocks past the planned protest to get to their job? And what can we do to either accommodate the employee with any concerns they might have? And in the parking context, for example, you might, get them a temporary parking pass for 2 weeks that's closer to the office or something like that. But that's an easy fix, right? And that's not always the case in every circumstance. So really, I think the first step always with employees is to say, how can we help? Tell us about your specific concerns. And then you're going to be evaluating, are those concerns reasonable? Have we as a business already addressed those concerns and we just need to communicate that better to our employees, or do we need to take additional steps? A lot of times simply just having the conversation and being open and honest will avoid any unnecessary escalation. But if that doesn't work, then you sort of need to tread carefully, because there could be some legal protections. So for example, OSHA does permit employees who refuse to work, they protect those employees if they reasonably believe they're in imminent danger. For that to apply, it's under the OSHA General Duty Clause. The employee has to have a specific fear of infection or risk. It can't just be a generalized fear of coming to the workplace. And the employer has to be unable to address that fear in a manner that would be designed to ensure a safe working environment. So it's a little bit tougher under OSHA. But again, let's circle back to that National Labor Relations Act that I touched on earlier. If you're unionized or not, as employer, your employees are permitted to engage in conversations about safety in the workplace. And there are some Obama era opinions from the NLRB that are still on the books saying, if I post something on social media and I'm friends with a coworker, that's enough to shroud me with protection. So if I'm saying my employer did this or that, or let's say your employee comes into work and picks up the phone and calls the hotline to complain about what they perceive as a violation of the safety standards being rolled out by any of these agencies, they're likely protected against retaliation for that. Other things, of course, if we've got a disabled employee or a sick employee who needs FMLA leave, of course, we're dealing with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act leave that's paid, and that's now 2.5 months old. And so if you have 500 or fewer employees as an employer, that applies to you right now. And if you're not up to date, then you should get there quickly. And then, of course, we have the typical Americans with Disabilities Act analysis. So anyone who needs a reasonable accommodation, like leave or remote work, at least temporarily, those are things that the employee and employer need to work through together through the interactive process. And so, it may not be the case that you can provide remote work for every single position, and it's always a case-by-case analysis based on the employee's own medical condition, what their own needs are. And I find that the best way to start that conversation is to say, how can we help? Because what you want to avoid there too is going too far down the road of asking medical questions that you don't necessarily need to know the answer to. Certainly you're required to gather a certain amount of documentation if you need it, if you were unaware of a medical condition or disability beforehand, but you still have to tread carefully. So that, again, I'm circling back to really broad-based concepts, which are 1, open and honest communication, and 2, engaging in conversation. And I think that those are just a handful of things to think about as you're dealing with folks who are saying, I'm afraid to come in the workplace. And then there's always the broader question, do we really need to be reopening right now? I think that's probably the first question that you need to ask, and it's not necessarily we're permitted to open right now, so let's do it. It's, do we need to open right now? And it's not just a legal consideration. You've also got to assess where you are in terms of the business thriving and operating, and sort of walking that tightrope of, on the one hand, we need to maintain productivity. We want there to be a business for these folks to be employed with, but on the other hand, what kind of risks are we taking on? And if we can work remotely and remain productive, we can avoid a lot of these issues and questions if we continue to do so until the risk abates. And the problem with that, of course, is that none of us know when the risk is going to abate. So, but those are just some of the issues, I think.
Yeah. To that point, it's been interesting talking to some of our HR executives, because so many of them will say, we're actually doing okay. It was a major disruption to move into this full work from home scenario. But they feel like it would be an even greater disruption to try to pull people back in too soon. And so we've talked for a while now about the difference between our small businesses, our retail shops, our hospitality industry, where they kind of have to be in that space in order to thrive and to do business. But you compare that to we have a lot of just back office and headquarter operations. So much of that work can be done remotely. And so to your point, if you can do it remotely and it's working for your company, we've had a couple of HR executives who just said, it's just too hard to meet all these guidelines. Why would I want to go through all of that work and the headache of that process when it's very possible we will have another wave, or it's just too soon in general? And so, I think to your point, it's sort of do we have to do this? Do we have to return? And if we do, then let's talk about what we have to put in place. And actually I'll pitch that over to Kelly then, talking about redoing office designs and the setup for desks. And, I keep referring to a couple of conversations I had yesterday with the HR executives, and one of them was talking about, well, now the desks are technically 6 feet apart if no one leans. So if no one's going from one direction to the other, then yes, they are 6 feet apart. And this particular executive was saying, well, but is that enough? Like, I don't want to just hit the bare minimum. I don't want to just do what is going to protect myself. I want to make sure I'm protecting my employees, and I want to make sure that my team feels valued and they know we're taking care of them. So Kelly, I'd love to hear from you what you're seeing, the trends, and are people are they following specific guidelines around the space layouts, or are they coming in with their own specialized guidelines? What has that been looking like?
Well, I think, thanks, Elizabeth. I think that that's a great question. And, as we started talking about going back to work, we all immediately jumped to, the desk. And as we've started obviously researching, surveying, and talking with our clients here as well as across the country, um, as well as surveying our own employees, there's a lot that happens before you even get to your desk. And what we're seeing is not so much here in Nashville, but in some of our other locations, we've got a lot of folks that take public transit to get to work. So it really starts from home before you even get to the building. So, I think I see a lot of folks encouraging, when possible, biking, walking, other methods of transportation to get to work. Our team in Nashville, there's a big group of folks that actually shuttle to our building from um, Nissan Stadium. Is that what it's called now? LP Field, Nissan Stadium. So, we're not going to put those folks on a shuttle. So, what are our other options? There's obviously the walking bridge, but really trying to free up some other parking scenarios once we are back in the office. So then once you actually get to the building, what does that look like? One of the things that that I've heard a lot of from a couple of site selectors is, the decentralization, not just from New York and Boston and the big cities, but even from places like Nashville, where, if I go to my office, it's pretty unlikely, although I should walk 13 flights of stairs to get to my office space and, avoid the elevator. But, in the suburbs, it's easy to walk 3, to 5 flights of stairs to get to your office space. So I think that we'll see, folks looking for alternate methods just to get, from their home to their office and then up to the office space. We're seeing in a lot of our larger office buildings, we're seeing obviously going to more of a hands-free entry system, or having some um, obviously sanitation stations right there after you touch a door handle, if you have to access that to get into the building. Stanchions or definite paths for queuing as you get to an elevator. There are limited number of folks allowed in elevators. I was in our office for a meeting yesterday, which was really kind of eerie. But it's there are 4 people allowed in an elevator at a time, and there are there's signage of where you can sit or where you can stand in the elevator. Um, and then one thing I noticed that I wasn't aware that we were doing was there were self-cleaning almost stickers and decals that had been added to all of the elevator buttons. So, just really trying to minimize, obviously we're not at a point where we can have touchless elevators just yet, or destination dispatch, which we're seeing in new buildings, where you don't have to press a button to say where you're going. But so this is an alternate method until we get to some of that touchless technology in existing buildings. Then once we get to our spaces, very similar to Dennis, our conference rooms will be, I'm not sure if we're actually physically removing chairs. We have some clients that will remove chairs and some clients that just say you've got to be 6 feet apart. We're seeing designated pathways, physical pathways. So similar to the grocery store, if you need to go to the restroom, you've got to go, in a certain path, whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise, so that you minimize kind of that interaction while you're up. We see really the reduction of some shared desking right now, which we did quite a bit of that in our office. But I think that will definitely go away. We we are seeing clients do somewhat of a checkerboard pattern, so that if you're looking at a floor plan where you used to have 3 people lined up together, or like a pod of workstations, it would be kind of every other seat would be filled, even if, Elizabeth, to your point, your conversation yesterday, even if it were a 6-foot station, a lot of times you'll have a return, so you may only be 4 feet apart. So, we do have a lot of clients that even if you have a 6-foot bench or a 6-foot desk, that they are going to that every other seat. So, that those are definitely some of the things within the actual workspace. Um, no use of microwaves. Dennis, I'm glad that you guys are doing that. Coffee, people have to do, bring in their own coffee, prepackaged food if we're going to have something like that. Um, and really just minimizing those. Honestly, they're those human interactions that we are all so accustomed to, and so many of us are really, you know, we need and we want, but so it's going to be really difficult. We call them hubs, or kind of our central areas. Those are going to be really underutilized for a while, and definitely for us, areas where we'll have to be masked when we're in those spaces. um, Restrooms as touchless as you can get from, um, most facilities now, obviously our urinals and our toilets are touchless, but not everybody has touchless soap. Not everybody has touchless paper towel dispensers. Having a toe pull on a door, we have tons of spaces that have been retrofitted to add some of those things already. Um, HVAC is a big deal right now, and adding in addition to general cleaning protocols being increased, adding additional filters, changing filters more often, adding UV lights for some of the air handling units. Dennis can talk about how that can be retrofitted. I'm not the expert on the retrofit, but we're doing that on a couple of our new projects that are under construction, or not quite under construction yet, but they're in design. So we're looking at some of those elements where we're not going to have additional fresh air, which is one option. One of our clients is elected not to do as much fresh air, but is adding the UV filters to some of the air handling units. Um, you know, in the long run, I think work from home is going to be much more um, acceptable and much more common than it ever has been. We have done this for 3 months now, and hopefully everybody has a better setup than my guest room, which is unfortunately behind me. But I don't think that I think the comment that Rebecca made of when is the right time to go back, we've all seen, I think in general, that we can be pretty productive. Zoom and Teams and Skype, and even an outdoor meeting, we've adapted pretty well. And I think, especially for our organization, it's going to be a while before we are back in the office. We're scheduled to work from home through July 13th, and we are surveying our employees again. And actually, this is more of a one-on-one survey. We issued a communication yesterday, and then I've talked with each of our studios here in Nashville and then in our other office, and talked about, if through Labor Day, what do you want to do? Do you want to continue to work from home? Do you want to go back to the office, like it was pre-quarantine? Or, do you want a mixture of both? I know that we've got a lot of daycares that aren't open. We don't have to worry about schools at the moment, but, there's a lot of other stuff that goes along with this. And we really want our teams to be able to, and our individuals to elect what's best for them and what's best for their family. That will also allow us to prepare. Okay, if we have more than 50% of our folks that want to go back to the office, how are we going to, stagger stations? How are we going to stagger work times and do, I hate to say shift work, but really having folks come in at different times? And, um, you know, I don't, I suspect a lot of people they'll want kind of a mixture of both. Um, but, I think it's I don't think we'll have a whole lot of people that are going to be really gung-ho to come back full steam ahead just yet.
Yeah, I think that childcare thing is going to be more prevalent than maybe many of us are giving it credit. We were on a call yesterday. We had the Dean of Business with Belmont speaking, and she talked about childcare and how important it's going to be. But it quite frankly may end up being something that, as a society, we have to address. That it's one thing for individual businesses to say maybe they're going to put childcare offered in their buildings, but what is this going to look like going forward? Because it's obviously shown to be a major deal. Because you're correct, we don't have school to deal with right now, but not all the summer camps are open. Not
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah, parents who had a master schedule. I've
Yes.
from our office. He's got this big calendar of all of his kids and where they are each week, and
Yep.
all of his camps are canceled. And so then all of a sudden that plan you had for summer is out the window. So we've heard a lot of HR executives talking about school specifically and actually planning around when school does return. So instead of trying to do it now in the middle of the summer when most parents are struggling to figure that out, let's wait till school starts
Exactly
back.
right. Yep.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that we have seen from a client's perspective, mobile work and work from anywhere has been a trend for a long time, but, we have a couple of clients that we work with that just felt like that was not for them. If they needed to see their employees on a daily basis, not only for collaboration, but, I think a little bit from a perception perspective. And those organizations had to kind of turn on a dime and, work from home. And there are some that will have employees that will permanently work from home, that will never go back to the office. So, it's, when you're forced to make some changes or some psychological changes, I think that changes our business model. One thing that, last thing I'll add is, at this point, we're not making design decisions and design changes. We're making just changes based on, we're making human decisions, which I think is really important to understand. There is a lot of fear and uncertainty, really, I think, in most people in whether it's going to the grocery store or out to eat or to the office. And we haven't had to worry about that office component yet. And so I think that there is, as people do start thinking about what do I want to do, there is a little bit of anxiety that we have to work through and be sensitive to.
Right. Absolutely. I do want to pop over. We've got some questions that have come up in the Q&A section. So one of them in particular, and I'm going to throw this out to the group, and you help me decide who needs to answer this, because it's saying 20% of occupancy seems to be the magic number employers are using for phase one return of office workers, but isn't really outlined in any of the governor's guidelines. Do we know where this number came from? And would you suggest employers be using this as a benchmark, even though it's not explicitly one of the governor's guidelines? So looking at 20% occupancy, I know, Dennis, you mentioned Skanska was at 50% right now. So just curious if any of you have had experience with that specific number, where you think it came from, and what you think our employers should be or could be using.
I'll talk. So, I think that I haven't seen that 20% guideline, but I know that there are 50% guidelines floating around. And I think as long as you're not under anything that's mandatory and you are reopening, the real consideration is that you need to be sending someone or a couple of people in to evaluate the physical space you have, and whether, sorry, that's my doorbell and dog from working at home. Hold on one second.
Oh, that was perfect.
Priceless, right? It's a situation.
We're all in it together.
Yep.
We are. But send a couple of people in and really look at your physical space and see, if we are following the social distancing and safety protocols that are rolled out by all of these agencies, what can our facility or our office space realistically hold? And then, based on those numbers, I think work backwards and determine, okay, are we doing shifts, and are we, saying, okay, if anyone raises their hand and wants to continue working from home and we meet the percentages we need, we're just going to go with that. But look at the physical space first.
Right. Yeah, and I will add, in talking to some of our HR executives as well, they've talked about, kind of to your point, what is our space capable of holding? So when, quite frankly, we've done a lot of this open office and cubicle work, and you've got hoteling and things like that with your desks. And so when you try to go from people kind of sitting right next to each other to let's give some social distancing space, you really cut down on the number of people who can fit into that space, which is actually probably back to Dennis and Kelly, looking ahead at future office planning for long-term projects. There's been talk around, do we anticipate there being a shrinkage in office needs and in office space needs because people will work from home more? Or do you think that there will be an increase in office needs because people are going to want more space for the employees that are in? So it's sort of this, I don't. So have either of you heard or seen anything that would show kind of a trend, or are you experiencing that with some of your new projects right now?
Dennis, I'll start, and then you
Go
can
ahead,
chime in.
Yeah. I mean, you're on the leading edge of this kind of stuff. So go ahead.
So I think right now, obviously, we're kind of looking at this from a pre-vaccine and post-vaccine. So I think pre-vaccine, I think with the work from home, we're going to see space kind of stay neutral, at least from the conversations we're having, because we are going to have, fewer people in the office, but more distance between those individuals. I know that what we have seen is that folks are not spending, they're spending money right now to make some separation between stations, or just on signage and things like that. Long term, I think that we will still see, I don't see a return to hardwall offices. I think when people go to I say that, I mean, potentially, but I think in the long run, I don't think people are going to say everybody's going to get an office like we used to. I just don't see that happening. But I think the office is going to be used for when you need to get together, when you need to collaborate, when you need to be face to face. And if your head's down and things like that, I don't think you're going to be in the office as much as we once were, at least for quite a while. But I do definitely think the the 5-foot benching is going away for a while. And it really, I think Nelson had the comment on here, and I think I touched on this. It's really sanitation, it's air filtration and air quality, indoor air quality. I think we'll see a shift to a lot of new buildings and potentially retrofits going to try to meet the well building standard, which is really a holistic. It's a little bit different than LEED, where it's really, LEED is more focused on sustainability. Well is really on overall health, employee health. But so far I don't see people contracting space. Another thing that we've heard a lot of is maybe kind of a hub and spoke. So you may have one office that is home base per se, and then some smaller offices in other areas, and that could be from a transportation perspective, again, to limit the exposure, getting to and from the office. But Dennis, what are you guys seeing? Anything under construction?
No, nothing right now. I mean, we have, a large office building under construction right now, and we hasn't been a huge change yet. I think there is still some wait and see.
Yep.
But I do think you're correct that the 5-foot little workstation is going to be gone. I think obviously the folks, the shared offices, that kind of stuff's going to go away. I don't see it going to hard offices all of a sudden either. But I think there's kind of, going to be this kind of in between. And thankfully for us here, we were kind of in that in between, because we went from all hard office space to an open office. And we kept our workstations fairly large at 8 foot. But even for me, when I did the study for our office, I had to draw little 6-foot circles around every
Yep.
person. And when there was an intersection between workstations, we have about 10 workstations that have closed signs on them where no one can work, because it either didn't provide 6 foot for someone passing by it, or if someone needed to kind of leave their workstation, it didn't leave a path to them pass someone without that 6 foot.
Yep.
So doing those studies is important of your workspace. So I do think some of it's workspace dependent. And I did have last week, I had our department heads come in and kind of live in the space as we had it all set up. You know, everything was set up here for about a week. Just live in the space, ask questions, and see where we needed to make adjustments before we did have some folks come back into the office this week.
Dennis, I'm curious, and this is literally my question. It's come up a few times, the idea of ventilation and the things that you can do to improve ventilation. What does that look like, and what does that mean?
I mean, Kelly knows as much as I. I mean, she talked about the UV system and filtration. I think a lot of it's going to be around added filtration and the whole the well-being aspect of a building. Like Kelly said, that's about the health of the building, the health of the people inside the building versus building materials, so to speak. So I think that's going to definitely. I think you're going to see more folks look at that on our projects, kind of more on the West Coast. We see a whole lot of that as being a huge part of office building projects, and I think we'll see more and more of it here in the Southeast and other areas where it really hasn't taken hold yet. But I think now that kind of the light is being shined on the filtration and the wellness of a building, we'll probably see a whole lot more of it on our future projects.
Okay. And Kelly, forgive me, this is not being in the industry at all, but when you talk about fresh air, are you talking about windows, or are you talking about pumping in fresh air from the outside? What does that look like?
Bringing in for here in the Southeast, it's bringing in fresh air from the outside. So as you have an HVAC unit or an air handling, you bring in fresh air, you treat it, and then it goes to the individual spaces. So there's obviously a certain amount of fresh air that you have to have in a space. LEED requires another different levels, but bringing in even more fresh air so that it can be filtered and pumped into the spaces is something that we're seeing in our climate. It's a little more difficult versus like the West Coast. We've got a client up in the Pacific Northwest, and that's really common for them. And it's it's a little more challenging here, but it's definitely that's it's a little bit more intense than adding the UV germicide lights that would then you bring in your fresh air, and as it filters, it's germs and stuff is killed. That's my technical term there.
Got it. Okay. We have one more question on here that I'll touch on, and this we'll throw it out to the group, but maybe Kelly, you as well. So have you seen any employers unknowingly make mistakes with their spaces that could endanger employees and try to make adjustments and it just didn't work? Have you seen anything like that?
I personally don't have too many clients that are back at work. So not yet. I do think, human nature is, when you go back, there are things that, you want to do. Like I said, I had a client meeting in the office yesterday, which was the first time we'd met actually in our space. And so I had a lot of, we had somebody there that was, propping open doors so we didn't have to, touch a lot of things. You try to stay 6 feet away, but, as you get together and are looking over a detail or looking at a finish or a material, it's human nature that you're just close to individuals, and so I can't answer that yet because I don't have that many clients that are back at work. I do have, one, actually 2 that are back at work, and they have 6-foot stations, and they're okay with that 6-foot spacing. So they haven't made modifications there. Their cafe is usually someplace where everyone eats, and they're not requiring folks to eat down in the cafe right now. They can eat in other places. So, I think that, they're more on the leading edge of back to work, where I think, a lot of our other clients are just kind of holding back a little bit, trying to wait and see what happens.
Right. Yeah.
Elizabeth, let me jump in. There's been a number of things that were said the 20% versus 50%, and I don't know where the 20% came from either. The questions that you can ask employees based upon CDC symptoms versus what you can't. There's kind of been a common thread, and one of the frustrating things, and I know this is probably true for everybody that's here individually as we're trying to figure out how to conduct our own selves, but also in our professional lives, is these advices, the advice from all of these different governmental entities changes all the time. And so I think one of the things that everybody has to be focused on is stay up to date with what it is the CDC is saying, because what they're saying today isn't what they said a month ago. And that's not a knock on the CDC, but we're in the middle of a dynamic and transitioning situation. So what might have been okay a month ago may be a mistake now if you haven't updated and stayed up to date on what the various and appropriate and applicable governmental agencies are saying for your situation. And one thing that I have seen in a couple of different instances is, and in my personal opinion, this is kind of a black spot in the law or in the guidances. The CDC and others have said have a plan for when someone gets sick, but there is no definition of what that plan is. And I think that it would behoove everybody on this call and all businesses to think that through and not say we'll figure it out when somebody gets sick, because if you don't, you don't want to be making ad hoc decisions like that. So everybody has a plan of how to come back to work, what we're going to do, but all plans work until they confront a problem. And the problem you're going to confront is when somebody gets sick. And what are you going to do? Are you going to shut everything down? Are you going to, how are you going to deal with that? And I think thinking that through can avoid some of the mistakes that we're talking about. So for whatever that's worth, it's something that's not laid out in the government guidance, unfortunately. So everybody's going to have to figure it out on their own, but important.
Right. Absolutely.
I'll just chime in with a couple of others that I've seen so far. So for example, in my building, Stites and Harbison is not in charge of this. It's the elevators for our building, and they're saying a maximum of 4 occupants, but they have little circle spots in the elevator, and they're like 2 feet apart.
Rebecca, that's how ours are. And I was like, I don't want 4 people in here with me.
Yeah. And then there have been lawsuits about masks already. So there's a restaurant in Texas that has been sued because they would not allow their employee to wear a mask. And then I think there have been a couple of charges or lawsuits from individuals who are disabled and have difficulty breathing when wearing a mask. And so they're challenging employers' decisions to require them to wear masks. So that's all just beginning from the lawsuit perspective, but those are a couple I've seen so far.
Wow. So many things that you don't think about. You think you've thought through so much of this, and then there's just so many other options. I know early on in this, one of our executives mentioned that they had literally designated one person on the HR team that all they did was monitor what was coming out from the CDC, what was coming out at the state level, what was coming out at the local level. And that was that person's sole responsibility, was to filter that information to make sure they were up to date. Now, hopefully it slowed down so that person's not still doing just that job. But I think that speaks to how complicated this can be. And even when your intent is to always do the right thing, you don't always know what the right thing is. And so it gets very complicated for sure. Thank you all so much for being with us today. This has been incredible. I've loved this conversation. This has been great feedback. We're going to post this to our website so that our HR executives and our other executives who are looking for this kind of content can find it easily. I will remind everyone, williamsonchamber.com/coronavirus is where we've got a lot of information and resources for our companies to use. We also have an events page on there. So we are doing more events than I thought were possible through virtual operations. So check that out there. We're doing everything we can to keep our companies connected and to make sure that we're getting information and content out as quickly as possible. So with that, we're going to go ahead. It's 12 o'clock. Everyone's got lunch plans. It may be at your kitchen counter, but enjoy your lunch. And thank you all so much for your time today. We appreciate it. Bye.
Thanks.